Hey everybody, it's the Commodore from the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and you are watching the 15th installment, magic number 15, of the weekly Wringer series here on theclanofthegraywolf.com. Now, today, in this installment of the weekly Wringer, I'm going to wrap up last week's question surrounding some of our favorite arcade classics, with reviewing some of the great stuff that's been posted on our comments, and give you some of the ideas bounced off of you guys about those old arcade machines. I'll give you some of my own theories and thoughts about it, including my own favorite arcade game of all time, or arcade experience of all time. And then we'll move right on to next week's Wringer question, which really is about where we buy our video games and where we're going to buy our video games in the future. So, without further ado, lots to get to because there's so much to talk about. You guys did a great job this week of putting your thoughts into the comments. I want to react to a lot of them, and there were so many different games that were brought up that I really want to spend as much time as I can getting to as many of them as there were that deserved great attention. I'm not sure that I'm going to get to all of them, but I'm definitely going to give it a shot. So, last week in the Weekly Wringer, I asked you all about your favorite arcade experience or your favorite arcade game, the game that you went back time and again back to the old arcades, whether they were real actual standalone arcades alone or they were actually pizza joints with machines or whatever the case might be. In any case, I asked you all what that favorite experience was outside of your home gaming experience. I had a lot of tremendous responses that, as I say, really do deserve mention. I'm going to try to get to every one of them that I can. So many of them that I had to write a lot down. So I've got a little cheat sheet here. I'm definitely going to use it. So I'm going to try to get to everybody's contributions that I thought just deserve some kind of mention. And there's so many I don't even know where to dive in. Let's start with Alatar with Dragon's Lair. Fantastic contribution a little later in the game in the comments during the week. Dragon's Lair was actually at PAX East. I didn't have an opportunity to play it, but it is one of the first games I actually played at home on the Commodore 64 that I had. Actually, I had a Commodore 128, hence my nick here on the site. But played Dragon's Lair extensively at home. I played the derivations from the arcade machine on all the different iterations it's had over the years on things like Laserdisc. I think the first time I ever played the arcade version was on Laserdisc, if you can believe that or not. DVD, it's now on DVD. It was on CD Interactive. It was on all these different kinds of... actually, I'm not sure if Dragon's Lair was. I think Space Ace, which was made by the Dragon's Lair folks, was on CDI. But anyway, all those kinds of games, which is kind of a mixture between an adventure game and a kind of quick action elements that were very simple generally and just kind of more reactionary and impulse, really to check your reflexes and see how quickly you could react to what was going on the screen. Really cool. Great experience. Dragon's Lair was very, very, very early in the kind of full-blown graphics, where you actually, it's something that was actually representative of the world. It was animated, but it was animated in a kind of realistic style. It wasn't kind of the squares and triangles and bloops and bleeps of the old arcade, but it was very early to have that kind of graphic quality, and people really latched onto it as a result. So that was a great contribution, and I appreciate it. Youngblood brought a fantastic one to the table. The Simpsons arcade game. Actually looked into this recently to see if there was any way that I could still play this game, because other than going out and trying to buy a cabinet, an old cabinet, which there is a tremendous market for these old arcade games out there now, guys. And I don't know if any of you know that, but there are these games just all over the place, and if you can find them, people are really starting to resurrect them, and they're becoming very popular, especially games from the mid to late 80s and the early 90s now too. And the Simpsons game fits that bill. It was a beat 'em up game that just had all the stars of the Simpsons. They had unique abilities. They were all unique characters. I just thought it was a really excellent game. Spent a lot of money and a lot of quarters. They had that at my local movie theater, and we played that a tremendous amount. Great contribution. It's a lot of similar games to that, like X-Men. The X-Men game for arcade was tremendous. Had a lot of money that I spent at the arcade in the X-Men game. Also, as Arcus pointed out, and many people echoed the sentiment, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle arcade game, very much along the same lines. That game is top 5 for me, 100%. It is a great, great arcade experience, not to be missed. And with the excitement surrounding the Turtles back in the late 80s and early 90s, you just couldn't get any better than that. I wasted a lot of money on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game. Really was a game that they then tried to emulate with a lot of other beat-em-up games on those home consoles. Some successfully, some not so successfully, as we know. But there were some tremendous, I guess, influence that came from that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade cabinet, and I spent a lot of time and money on there. One that Mike 352 suggested that I thought was a great contribution is Afterburner, an old Sega classic that I played a lot. And this one was also at PAX East, and had a long line behind it, so I didn't get to jump on it when I was at the Classic Arcade while at PAX East. But man, that was a great game. It had the flight stick, and you'd actually, if you go look it up on YouTube, you'll see that as a flight stick you move around, which would actually fly the F-14 around the screen, and then you could use the guns, or you could actually lock on and launch missiles if you were able to hold something in your target long enough. So it's kind of an on-rails shooter. Really great experience. Space Harrier was very similar, as was pointed out. I really, out of those two, I don't remember playing a lot of Space Harrier, but I remember playing Afterburner. Again, it was at my local movie theater. Played Afterburner all the time, not to be missed. That is a classic game. Again, very influential. Lots of games really came out of that era. Afterburner really was that kind of on-rails experience par excellence. So great contribution as well. Let's see what else. So, a few of you mentioned the Star Wars trilogy games. That is fantastic. One of those games that I actually only played at Disney World. And I wasn't sure if it was only at Disney World. Then I went to some of the bigger arcades, and you could find it there as well. But man, those were a lot of fun. You actually climbed inside the box, and you could actually move around, and the huge screens in front. And I mean, that was just an awesome game, and it really started arcade folks thinking about how they could make cabinets that were really this immersive experience. And there were a ton of those as well. Some of those games that were kind of almost scary to get into. I remember Jurassic Park made one very similar to that called Lost World, where you'd get inside, and it was kind of like getting inside of a Jeep, and they'd even have curtains sometimes you'd pull over the side so that you couldn't see anything out, and it would be very dark in there, and you'd be in this very immersive experience in the Jeep at Jurassic Park. Cool ideas, but I loved the Star Wars trilogy games, particularly flying the snow speeders and doing the Death Star trench, which a few of you mentioned. I could not agree more. Those are fantastic and classic arcade games, and some of the best arcade experiences I have ever had. Another contribution I have to talk about is from Forever Nova. Kicked off the conversation. It was picked up by a few of you. Is DDR. Wow, it's tough to think about a game that has really kept the arcade experience going for the past decade, really, more than DDR. I don't think there is one. As more and more games became available on the home market and were just as good at home as they were going to the arcade, DDR really was the game that kept the arcades open, if they were able to stay open, because DDR would always have a line, and it would always be very busy, and it would always be very busy right at the busiest times when you'd want them there. I mean, I remember even going into like an ESPN zone arcade. This was probably about 10 years ago now, and it was just flooded with DDR machines, and the DDR machines had longer lines than anything else in the whole arcade. So DDR, again, the home experience, I don't think probably equals, but all of the rhythm games that became so popular for so long, no, they weren't directly pulling from DDR, but the success of DDR, I think, really drove all the rhythm games and their popularity, which was, as we know, far-reaching, even though I think it's coming to an end now. And going back to Mike, really glad. See, these are the great offshoots about the Wringer. You guys went out and bought the arcade classics, a game you probably would never have purchased otherwise. Love that the Wringer is bringing some interest back to some of those old classic games, and love to see that you're going out to the store and picking it up too. That's what this is all about. Let's share some experiences. Let's go out. Let's get those games going. Let's get those nostalgia juices flowing, and let's see what happens with getting some of those old arcade experiences back, and even some of those old video game experiences that we've had, and reliving them. Speaking of reliving some old arcade experiences, I was really hoping that some of you would bring some stories, because when you think about arcades, being separate from just having a system in your house, the arcades really did offer an experience. It was something that you went somewhere to do, and that made it very different. And so I was hoping that some of you would kick up some of your stories of how you went places to play games, and it definitely did. A few of you mentioned the legendary Chuck E. Cheese's, which and Showbiz Pizza as well. Chuck E. Cheese's was started by Nolan Bushnell, the man that founded Atari, and that was a place where kids just went to play. I remember going to Chuck E. Cheese, having birthday parties like many of you, and playing some of those classic arcade cabinets. I remember having those small built-in units where you could choose maybe 3 or 4 different games, and you could have one person on either side of the box, and then you'd each have a controller, and you'd be playing through this piece of glass. And tremendous experience. I remember playing those games all the time, including Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man, two of the games that I kind of teed up for you guys from last time. Great games, lots of fun, and even if they are repetitive, and even if they do look a little strange and stupid to us now, I defy you to go back and get really good at them. They are very hard. You start to learn how difficult some of those games back then were. Even if you knew what you were doing, they were actually really hard. And I recently played 1942 and 1943, the sequel, a tremendous amount at an arcade cabinet that is at a site where I work, and playing that a lot, and it was just so much fun, and a tremendous experience. And I love going back and playing some of those old games. So those are another couple of my favorites. But anyway, to get back to the stories that are not mine, GRA 007 not only suggested Street Fighter II, which absolutely deserves credit and mention here, but told a fantastic story surrounding the X-Men cabinet. If you guys haven't read that comment, read it. Fantastic story. That's the kind of stuff I love to see coming out on the Wringer. I love hearing how those experiences were back then, because it's good to know that you guys are still out there, that I wasn't the only one that had arcade stories, and it really shows how video games are a part of who we are. Forget the video games versus art distinction right now. Forget everything you know about geekdom and video games being uncool and all that kind of stuff. Just forget it for a minute, and think about video games being a part of your life. One of the reasons you're probably on the site watching me right now is because you've had, in some way, a video game experience that helped to shape who you are or shape your life in some way. I love reading stories like GRA 007's X-Men Club. even if he doesn't keep in contact with them now, knowing that those experiences are there and that you still remember them and you can, recite them when prompted by an idiot with a video series on a website. Awesome. Thanks for sharing, and thank you all for sharing some of those great stories and experiences from the arcades, because pretty soon, guys,